All right, well, it's about 10 o'clock here on the left coast, and it's time to get started. I want to thank everybody for attending. What I wanted to do, in the process of having all this traffic at Two Green Energy, I'm constantly coming up with a way of making this more interesting for everyone associated with it. And somebody gave me the idea just a couple of months ago to do a monthly survey. I have a lot of experience with surveys, not so much online, but for a period of about 30 years, I was a marketing consultant to the high tech world, I suppose you could say, the IBMs and Hewlett Packards. Um, and that um, familiarized me with the power of really getting people to express themselves and what you can learn from that. Now, it's true that that people don't necessarily understand the truth, but the fact that they believe what they believe is important. It becomes a truth in and of itself. And therefore, I think it's an extremely important exercise to just simply ask people to verbalize what they're thinking and feeling with respect to any one issue. And I want to thank, there were over 500 of you who participated in the survey that we did in May, and I've summarized some of those results here that I want to just cover with you. I hope you'll find this interesting. Now, as always, we have this sidebar, and I do want to urge people to write in questions. I'll take as many of them as we have time for. I also wanted to mention before I forget that just another idea that someone came across that I think is a reasonable thing to pursue here is to have physical events. So next October 6th in New York City, we'll get together at a hotel to be named um, for an interactive session that I refer to as on-ramp, wherein green chip stocks industry analyst Jeff Siegel and I will present a whole several hours of information associated with renewable energy and where this is going, what are the impediments, where are the winners and the losers. This guy, Jeff Siegel, I've known him for a number of years. I interviewed him for my last book, really top-notch guy. I'm looking forward to doing that. And I propose to do this every 6 months. I propose to do one in New York City, normally in the fall, and then maybe San Francisco or Los Angeles in the spring. So we'll see where we go with that. And that is on the Two Green Energy site. If you just look for it, if you go to twogreenenergy.com and then /on-ramp, you'll be able to find that easily. And I believe there's an ad for it in the sidebar. So what I wanted to do is just get right into this um, subject. I'm in the process of preparing my next book, which I propose to publish right after Christmas. Um, again, largely based on a compilation of interviews, but a great amount of speculation of kind of interviews and kind of looking at the subject of what are the impediments to renewable energy. So the first book obviously was a kind of survey of the subject. At this point, I want to know why this isn't happening. This has been a disappointment for a lot of us, in particular those of us who say, well, why is the United States not taking a leading role in this? Why are we doing such a poor job and not even following the rest of the world very well in terms of migrating away from fossil fuels and nuclear? The sign, this is an extremely popular subject. This is not something that's just arcane and known to only a few with the BP oil spill and Fukushima and so forth. This is on everybody's mind. So why is it that this is moving along so slowly, especially in the United States? So, I've been asking college professors and industry pundits and luminaries and journalists and everybody I could get my hand on, and and as you know, or at least 500 of you responded to the survey in May. So this had one specific area of scope, and that is simply why is this moving so slowly? And I just simply asked people to verbalize what they found on this. And I just want to go over the highlights quickly. Largely, what you'll notice on this thing is that people said it's the political and economic pressure. It's the huge lobbies that are controlled by the oil and coal industry that are making this thing move so slowly. So the people noted that the oil industry employs 7,000 um, lobbyists and is therefore um, whose job it is to extract favors, and they're doing a very good job at this. So this is facilitated by the fact that the media is not really trying to get to the root of this. Gone are the days of Woodward and Bernstein where we had an active media who would try their hardest to get to the truth. In fact, they're facilitating the problem, and Americans are not are just simply eating what they're served. And so we have an issue here where we're putting very little pressure on our political leaders, our elected leaders, to do anything about this. So what I thought I would do, I'll tell you the way I constructed this survey, and we'll take it from there. What I did was I asked people to rate on a scale from 1 to 10 the degree to which they bought into various lines. In other words, there are 8 or 10 different reasons why this could be moving slowly. To what degree do people find this credible? So first of all, I said, this is something that I believe, that it's unrealistic to expect our elected leaders to do anything with respect to this simply because their job comes up for renewal every 2 years. So here you have a case where if you expect someone to make a political decision that is not going to be favorable to them in that election cycle, you simply have an unrealistic expectation. So people were, as you can see, they're 6.7 on a scale from 1 to 10. People agreed with me that that was the case. I also wanted to give people the opportunity to weigh in on this. It is true, for instance, that wind turbines kill bats and birds and so forth. It turns out, fortunately, that people are not heavy into believing in this. It turns out that there are 70,000 birds killed by wind turbines every year, but there are 5.7 billion birds killed by automobiles. So in other words, they're 800 times more likely to be killed by um, automobiles, and actually 1,200 times more likely to fly into plate glass windows. Um, so that is not an enormous factor here. Going on, it seems to me that people do not have an appetite for pain. So in other words, the fact that this is expensive at this point is going to put the common consumer into a place where they're not going to want to pay more for electricity, and that is viewed as somewhat important there. See. I also wanted to throw in this thing about smart grid. To a degree, smart grid really is a gating factor on this thing. We have an enormous amount, just to take an example of the transmission distribution angle on this thing, we have wind is available in the plains, we have solar that's available in the southwestern deserts, we have population centers that are a long way from both of these. So the degree to which we can transmit the power to where it needs to be, store it as required, deliver it according to demand response issues is extremely important, and people did note that. We also noted that there's somewhat in some level of importance placed on the fact that the price of natural gas is way low because of recent discoveries. The degree to which oil companies have repositioned themselves as energy companies, and thus we have Chevron saying that it's investing in renewables, which is true to some minor level. So the bottom line here is that people do agree that there is some obfuscation, essentially, by the traditional energy companies that's been effective. To my surprise, there's not an awful lot of agreement in this fact that the military-industrial complex will always find a place and a reason to fight. So this is kind of, people are kind of sitting on the fence on this one. I personally believe what Eisenhower told us half a century ago, that when you have a standing army of this size, you have a real mess. He said, Fortunately, I'm a military guy. I know how to use this, but the next president may not be, and then you're going to have a real mess on your hands, and that's my estimation, precisely what we have. There you've got the issue that global warming is a hoax and so forth. So in other words, the imperative is overhyped, and people do agree with that. I just put up a blog post a couple of minutes ago on this subject. In my estimation, um, the issue about global warming resolves into the fact that there is an incentive to cheat on both sides. If I were betting on this thing, I would be betting against the theory that you have thousands of serious climate scientists who are PhD carrying nerds, pardon the expression, but in other words, they're not business people, they're academics. And they have the concept that these people have colluded to defraud the American public strikes me as a little hard to believe. I also think that if you are looking for a motive to cheat on this thing, you're going to find a much greater motive in supporting the sale of trillions of dollars of oil and coal than you are in a few $1,000,000 for atmospheric research. So the whole thing just doesn't make any sense to me. But hey, that's just me. Next one here we have this issue of intermittency. It is true that ultimately, the intermittency of renewables, the fact that the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time, is going to become an issue. Right now, we have less than 2% penetration of renewables in the United States, and at this point, the concept of energy storage is completely academic, so there's no impact whatsoever, nor will there be for the coming 10 or 15 years, on the fact that there is intermittency associated with renewables. And here you have the fact that we're in the middle of a recession. The private capital isn't going anywhere, let alone into a subject that is unproven. And a lot of these technologies, as we move forward into developing the technologies associated with PV and wind and geothermal and concentrated solar power and so forth, these will become a lot more safe in terms of the perception of investors. But currently, you do have trillions of dollars of private capital sitting on the side, and that was viewed as an important matter. But as I say, not as important as this one. In other words, the if people had to say what is the most important reason that this is moving slowly, it's simply because of the political clout, the fact that we have 7,000 lobbyists running around the Beltway extracting favors from our congresspeople. We have $5 or $6 subsidizing oil and coal for every dollar subsidizing renewables is a mess. And until we have campaign finance reform that meaningfully changes the way in which these mega corporations interact with our elected leaders, this is not going to change. So I have urged people to support what's referred to as move to amend. There's a move to develop a constitutional amendment that would eliminate, that would override the recent Supreme Court decision by the Federal Election Commission versus Citizens United, which granted power of free speech, the right of free speech under the First Amendment to corporations. So in other words, an ExxonMobil or a Chevron can spend as much money as it wants influencing our elections. In other words, they can they can spend billions of dollars ensuring that a certain candidate is elected or not elected. Pardon me. So that's, in my estimation, that's something of a mess. And when it looks to me as though of the 500 or so respondents here, there's a great deal of agreement with me on that subject. Here's the next one. In other words, that the market rather than the government should decide on these technologies. This, as you can see, 4.8 on a scale from 1 to 10, a kind of lukewarm response. In my estimation, government has the imperative to step in cases where pure market economics do not work. And certainly in the case of energy, where you have more than half of the mercury that is found in the agricultural areas of the central part of California is coming from the coal plants in China. So you have externalities associated with fossil fuels, and you have property rights that are unclear. So in other words, who owns the oceans? Who owns the skies? What are we going to do about the fact that this is a global problem? So private enterprise and private capital and the private sector generally cannot be expected to make decisions that are going to deal with issues on this scale. So, and it looks as though the respondent base agrees with me on that. All right. So here we have um, just the issue of expense again. In other words, that there is some level of sympathy for the fact that we're not at grid parity. We're a few years away from the time at which, for instance, PV, photovoltaics, will come down in price to the degree to which it's cost competitive. In other words, an incremental kilowatt hour of energy from solar will be the exact same price as that created from coal. At that point, I would suggest that the game's over anyway. Nobody's in their right mind is going to be investing in a new coal plant when you can have that amount of energy without any environment, with much less environmental impact. But until that point, you do have an interesting issue on your lines. Okay. So now I ask people at the end of the day, well, so what do you think? So you've rated these 11 or so questions on a scale from 1 to 10. What do you think? And here's the tabulation of that. And as you can see, almost half of these people pointed to the fact that the big energy is an industry. You don't have a geothermal industry. You've got a couple of people doing research and trying to deploy this and trying to get this off the ground, but you don't have a mega industry that's been around for 100 years, and that's the level of inertia and in fact corruption that you face trying to make this get this show on the road. A number of people, instead of saying, well, here's what I think about this thing, said, look, it's so gross. Here's a few examples of this thing. This the thing speaks for itself. In other words, the fact that the Czech Republic has twice as much PV installed as the entire United States. I mean, if you don't think there's a problem there, I don't know what to tell you. So, just to summarize this thing, the de facto energy policy, we don't have an energy policy in the United States, but the one that we have in fact is created by powerful but largely unseen forces, and this runs power counter to the will of the people who, and it could be summarized by saying that the will of the people is becoming more clear every day, that the U.S. must not be content to become an afterthought in this global energy picture, that we need a level playing field, that needs to come by internalizing the externalities, in other words, forcing producers and consumers of energy to pay the true comprehensive cost of what they're doing. And we need to experience the upside that is associated with the fact that there are 3 green jobs created for every one that's lost as we migrate to this multi-trillion-dollar industry over the next couple of decades. So at the end of the day, we need courageous, honest leaders. And I guess we've been saying that since Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was made, you know, 60 years ago. I'm sure we've been saying it long before that. But that's essentially the issue on this thing, that the people are not, the will of the people is frustrated by the fact that our political leaders are doing exactly the opposite of that which we're asking. I heard an interesting talk the other day. Bill Ritter, the governor of Colorado, spoke at the Renewable Energy Finance Forum in New York City last week. And he said, the University of Colorado did an extremely clear, comprehensive study of the population. In other words, what do voters want with respect to clean energy policy? And there were millions of participants, more than a statistical valid sample of these folks weighed in on this subject. So but the congressman, when the Congress reconvened, the the folks, the senators from Colorado voted the exact opposite. They knew what the will of the people was, but they also knew how they got elected in the first place and the favors that they owed to whatever people, and they voted directly opposed to the will of the people. So when we live in a democracy in which that level of idiocy and corruption is in place, it is really that hard to wonder, what we're getting here. Okay. So the June survey, here's a little snippet of the June survey. I asked people basically, okay, so where are you, you know where we are with respect to energy. Where are you, um, how do you feel about this thing? Are you optimistic that this is going to have a soft landing? And as you can see here, about a third of people say, yes, I am optimistic. We will innovate our way out of this thing. We'll treat each other better. I see a kind of dawning of the age of Aquarius or whatever. I see something. Normally, it's not that. Normally, it's about people saying, we've been here before, and we always come out the other side. And the level of technical innovation is unprecedented now. I have a good feeling about this. About a quarter of people say, I don't see that at all. In fact, I think that we're going to have mass starvation associated with commodity shortages and so forth. But a great number of people, again, talk to things like, this is a tough challenge. We need to make sacrifices and change our lifestyles to the degree to which we're willing to do that. We will succeed. And again, the government, 40% of people just simply volunteered that if we don't have government leaders who break these corrupt ties, we're dead. So that was kind of interesting, and I'll have a further report on this coming up. Now, I want to thank everybody for doing this. Let me take a look at questions. I do want to point out that yes, we will archive this webinar. We'll have it up shortly. I know I've been saying that. My technical team is a little bit overwhelmed at this point, but I think we're right at the point at which we will have this done shortly. So one of our participants asked, how do you get cost realities broadly communicated to the general public regarding the real cost of the externalities? This is a fantastic point, and I don't know the answer. I know, except to say that this is what gets me out of bed every morning to try to communicate to as many people as I can what's going on here. My interview with James Woolsey, the ex-director of the U.S. CIA, in the book that I published last fall, Renewable Energy Facts and Fantasies. In this, he points to Boyden Gray, who is certainly not a left-leaning tree hugger. He's a very conservative academic businessman. Um, he points to the fact that we spend $250 billion a year addressing the increase in healthcare costs alone associated with the aromatics, in other words, the breathing the exhaust of coal and oil. That's $250 billion a year. So when I started talking about the externalities and kind of identifying them and quantifying them and doing something about them, this concept a couple of years ago, people would look at me with a blank stare. Now I don't receive as many blank stares when I talk about this. I think there are a great number of studies that are going into this. And I think at a certain point it will become more clear to everyone what's the cost associated, for instance, with ocean acidification, with the fact that the fragile ecosystems. I mean, there is some, for whatever reason, some level of debate about global warming, but there's very little debate about ocean acidification and what this is doing to our fisheries. Um, so I have a feeling that in the next few years there'll be more specific, detailed studies associated with the externalities of what we're doing here. So excellent question. And Tim, how do you get the costs broadly communicated? The answer is I don't know, except for, my own attempt at Two Green Energy is simply exactly that, to say we have problems that are associated with moving this forward and understanding exactly what we're doing to ourselves. And to the degree to which we let the established energy industry hide this from us, we deserve what we get. So thanks for an excellent question. All right. Well, very good. I've enjoyed the conversation here, and I hope this was meaningful to everyone. And what I'm going to be doing is uh, getting this up on the website. Let's take another question here. Garth asks, one of the major problems faced when trying to permit and license a project isn't financing, nor is it Congress, but the mid-level structure of our federal service agencies. There's a stone wall that a project um, faces beyond its financial limits. It must be the personal agendas of those federal employees. Why? It's an excellent question as well. I have a friend who in turn has a friend who used to be the CEO of Western Digital, a company for which I worked for years as a consultant. Um, this is a fellow who went out of retirement, who became the head of the GSA. So here's a guy who, an extremely high-powered executive who went to manage a, multi-trillion-dollar budget, who quit after a year. And he went in on the first day and he met with some of these extremely highly placed federal employees, and he said, okay, here's what I want to do. I want a budget, I want accounting, I want transparency. And they go, we're not doing that. And he goes, well, what do you mean? And he goes, well, one thing that you need to understand is we're the B team. And he goes, what are you talking about? He goes, we be here before you got here, and we be here after you're leaving. And within a year, the guy had quit. So there's no doubt in my mind that the level of uh, decency and honesty in Washington does leave something to be desired. And I don't know, Garth, it's an excellent question. I don't know what to say about that, except to say that I simply hope that the level of rancor associated with a public that becomes increasingly aware of what's going on this rises to the level that none of this can take place anymore. All righty. Well, very good. Again, I have certainly, I appreciate everybody being here, and I'll have this up on the website soon. For those who missed it, hope to talk to you again in the not too distant future. Thank you. Bye now.